I have to confess I changed the title. And I'm going to talk generally about groundwater governance and management. And I was really delighted when we went around and did introductions, and I thank the organizers for doing that, to hear that many of you are interested in policy. I came here thinking that I might be the only person trained as a social scientist. And then I thought, oh no, Nick's going to be here. But then Nick has an undergraduate and master's degree in geology, so there went that idea. But I have no formal training in natural physical sciences other than what I took back in high school, really. I'm a social scientist by training, but I've really morphed into a water person and someone who's taken the framework of economics and the academic training to analyzing and looking at mostly real world water problems. And pretty much everything that I know about water, I've learned on the job, both as an executive director of a regional water district and through just doing it. And so my discussion and my presentation is almost the maybe obverse of the questions you're asking. The question about taking lessons from the high plains and applying them elsewhere. I'm a big believer in sharing lessons. I'm a big believer in identifying best practices, and some of what I'll talk about will demonstrate that to you. I'm not here to give you an in-depth analysis of Arizona groundwater. I could do that, but that's not what I'm here to do. I'll just say a few things about that, and if some of you have questions about that, I'll be happy to answer. So I do like to tell a little bit of from where I come and what I do. Now, where I really came from is New Jersey, but I don't admit that in too many settings. But I do get a little sensitive to New Jersey jokes. So, but I've lived in Arizona now for close to 38 years, and I've been at the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona since early 2002, and I've been director there since July 2004. And we just recently redid our tagline and our mission statement. You can read it there. We do very applied work. We're part of the National Institutes for Water Resources Network. I put down our website and also our subscribe button. If you really are ever interested, whether students or practitioners, in some good resources on what is going on in Arizona, come to our website. There are other good websites I could recommend to you, but I happen to think ours is about the easiest to navigate, although we're about to just redo it so it's tablet and phone size friendly. We're in the old Boy Scouts building, slightly off campus. How many of you have been to the University of Arizona campus? I don't know if you know where the football stadium is. It's kind of to the southeast corner. We're just within kind of stone's throw of there. This is an old building that was sold or donated to the University of Arizona Foundation and then became a University of Arizona building. It's the old Boy Scouts building. What is the motto of the Boy Scouts? Be prepared. And that's a mother of a scout or a wife of a scout answering. Usually I look to the guys in the audience to give me answers. You were kind of quiet here. But be prepared. And I often say, and I'll say it here, that that's a good motto for a center that's focused on water management and understanding critical water resources. We have to be prepared. And in fact, that's what everybody is really working toward. And then what I work on, for this audience, I put groundwater, 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 because that is what I work on a lot. In Arizona, we depend on groundwater for about 40% of the water supplies. Obviously, some regions are 100% dependent on groundwater. Others have a mix of water sources. And so groundwater is very important, and it's very interesting. I saw IAH, International Association of Hydrogeologists, as a sponsor of this. And when I started hanging around with IAH people and in the international as well as national scene, and Bill Alley at the National Groundwater Association, it was always like these, the groundwater hydrologists and hydrogeologists seemed like the Rodney Dangerfield. They had this Rodney Dangerfield complex. And for those of you old enough to know who Rodney Dangerfield is, he got no respect. His jokes are all about getting no respect. And to me, somebody coming into it from a very practical side of things, it's like groundwater is where it's all at. You know, there are no apologies or, you know, feeling like you're second class or anything. It is where it's at. So I do some work, and I'm going to talk about it, some national scale surveys of governance and management. And the reason for undertaking those studies are to get at exactly what you're looking at here. What are the lessons learned? What are the best practices? And we did one study, we're in the middle of another, but we've also faced some obstacles, which I'll mention very briefly in a few moments. We do a lot of artificial recharge. We have large basin aquifers that have a lot of storage room in them because of pumping, and we are making use of that storage capacity to particularly store Colorado River water delivered through the Central Arizona Project when it's available for future use, when it's less available. And as mentioned, we've been working on Transboundary Aquifer Assessment. Bill Alley, when he was at USGS, was a lead on this nationally authorized program to look at aquifers at the shared border with Mexico. I do work a lot on Colorado River Basin issues, and if there's ever a critical issues forum waiting in the wings, this could be one of them you might want to think about, but you may not want to tackle that. It's actually a pleasure to be in Colorado not talking about Colorado River Basin issues, because that's usually what we're talking about, and we get into the whole thing about upper basin versus lower basin, and it's nice to be here for something different. And what I do a lot of is trying to characterize what we do. What I find out there in the real world, and those of you who have been in or are parts of government agencies, you know, a lot of times it's not part of your job description or reward structure to write articles about things. Yet, for those of you who do research, you know, you look and you do your scholarly searches and you try to find articles, and often you can find articles about some of these very important practices. And so part of what we do at the center, and I do personally, is sometimes on the more descriptive side, and to help people understand what it is we're doing and what are the challenges associated with that. And we do that at multiple geographic scales. And of course, as a professor, student education is very important. Having students understand the complexity of the context is very important when dealing with water resources. The photos, a photo taken outside one of the pumping station for the Central Arizona Project. That water is all pumped uphill to Phoenix and then on to Tucson, and we visit a pumping station, and it's always a great photo if you can get students with hard hats. Maybe here at Mines, Paul, you do that all the time, but we don't. Yeah, there were. I should have figured. But we don't get to do that much in Arizona, so that's always fun. And we do public education a lot, and a lot of outreach and engagement. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But before I do go on to some of the more specific content of my talk, I do want to mention on the public engagement and outreach, and Jean mentioned that I'm president-elect now, she didn't remember what organization, of the university's councils on water resources. And I can't remember if Mines is a member or not, but Paul, maybe if you're not, somebody can come to you with a request for membership. It's got about 63 universities across the country that are members, and it puts out a journal, and one of its signature event is an annual conference. Our annual conference this year, which I happen to be chairing, is June 13th to 15th in Fort Collins, and we have the call for abstracts out. There will be a whole track on the Ogallala Aquifer based on the project that Amy mentioned when she gave her introduction. So if some of you are interested in learning more and more about that project, that will be an entire track through the whole conference on the Ogallala, in addition to a lot of other things, including we'll feature Bill Alley and his wife's new book, Bill and Rosemary's Alley's new book on groundwater, so I'll put my plug in for you to take a look at that abstract. It's ucowr.net is the website if you're interested. So, I do teach a course in Arizona water policy. I give lots of talks and to the public. And this is a slide I use often, and I wanted to put it up here because I do want to talk about governance, I want to talk about management, and of course that's all related to policy. And what are the things that determine policy? And I have two underlined, and I think that's really important here for these discussions. One is the legal framework, and the other is, and it relates to the legal framework, is how centralized or decentralized things are. And for those of us who saw the movie yesterday, we heard, let people take care of themselves. what level are we going to go down to let people take care of themselves? I mean, there are many different levels. We tend to be very decentralized here in the US, and then within states like Texas, like we heard about yesterday, like Nebraska, like Arizona and others, there is some autonomy or determination made at local levels, but how local do you get? I think that's a really important question. And then so much is dictated by the laws and what the laws allow and don't allow. And obviously resource availability and the like, that part is fairly obvious. And then context, I already mentioned the word context, and that is, I'm not gonna put, well, I may have it in a later slide, but often this is where I show the water cycle to remind everybody water may move around, change in quality, and the like, but we don't create water. Sometimes we have to remind people of that. And then, of course, obviously, the geographic context is extremely important. So now I'm going to reveal basically the sum total of my work on the Ogallala Aquifer in this one slide. And I wasn't invited as an expert, so that's okay that I only have one slide on the Ogallala Aquifer. But back in 2009, I was the lead co-author of an issue paper issued by CAST, which is the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, located in Ames, Iowa. And they put out issue papers, they commissioned, they have a whole process for it. They identified a few of us in different states, and they wanted a paper on this topic, water people in the future, water availability for agriculture in the United States. And the 4 case studies were California, Arizona, Florida, and then the High Plains Aquifer. And so we had different, each of those case studies was written by a different different expert. And then we brought together some concluding findings and possible recommendations. And I remember what struck me about the concluding paragraph for the High Plains Aquifer, which was written by, I have to go back, Jess, I believe is his name. You can see it up there, from Nebraska, is this what I've highlighted in that reddish color. No utility would be gained from leaving water in the ground. And this goes back to those of us who saw the movie last night. I made a few notes. I was a little worried people might thought I was texting or something when I had my phone on, but I was actually making some notes on my phone of a few things. And one of the notes was where it was referenced that oil and gas, they just exploit the resource. So why shouldn't we just do that for water, right? That was the implication of that comment. And that's really the implication here, is that there's so much value to be gained from using that water for farming. So what is the utility from leaving water in the ground? I'm going to leave it up to you in your discussions to talk about that. But I remember I was very struck by that because it was just such a depleted kind of approach. So I'll leave it at that. So just to give you now some very broad context for some of the discussions about groundwater and groundwater governance, I do want to mention that there have been, and there are still some ongoing international forum and initiatives related to groundwater governance. The Global Environmental Facility funded a big project with the FAO of the UN, the UNESCO International Hydrologic Program, the International Association of Hydrogeologists were part of that. And they came out at the World Water Forum last April and released these 3 reports: a global framework for action, a global diagnostic, and a shared vision for groundwater governance. And these are all available for download from that site. The premise of that project was to first go around the world and hold 4 or 5 regional consultations and actually have people come in from different parts of the world and talk about their groundwater issues, their groundwater governance, their groundwater challenges, and then attempt to put that together, again, with the express purpose of sharing good practices and informing the latter parts of the project. There's also an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD initiative, called the Water Governance Initiative, which is about 3 years old now. It's a very amorphous group. There happens to be very little US representation on it. Of course, the OECD has 33 member nations, and there's representation from countries that are not members. But it attempted to cross-cut some of the different areas and bring people together to talk about water governance, not just groundwater governance, of course that's incorporated in it, but water governance generally. And so they have formed indicators, had a whole big study on stakeholder engagement for inclusive water governance, and again, looking for best practices, looking at case studies, doing what we're trying to do here. And these reports are available on their website, which I put on the bottom. I know these slides are going to be made available, so I try to provide websites whenever possible in case people wanted to look at that. But in the context of working on these international efforts, I went to 3 of the 5 regional consultations that I mentioned for that groundwater governance project. You know, you'd have representatives of countries, and a country could be an island state of 80,000 people, or it could be a tremendous country of millions or even a billion people. And so when we came to the regional consultation that was going to be in continental Europe, that would include the US. The US was part of that group, as was Canada, as opposed to the Latin Americas, which had its own. I said, you know, we've got to have people understand that you can't paint the US picture with a single brushstroke, a single color. That you have to understand how there are so many differences. And so I undertook a self-funded little study that we called it the initial groundwater survey, or the initial survey. And the idea of calling it the initial survey was that it was going to provide us with some seed information to then develop a proposal, which we did, but didn't get funded in these days of competition for funding, for a more in-depth analysis. What the goal of this effort has been, and we have all this stuff on our website, was to try to get in depth with different states and different regions, and not just have a simple survey, but then do interviews and then do follow-up and do it, help the survey inform us as to where some of the best examples were, and then interview people. But we never got the funding for the interview. We're now doing a second, pretty cursory level survey with a grant. But I give you all this background before I put up this slide, which I discussed with Anne Blee last night. We asked a series of questions, and one of them was, does state law recognize the connection between surface and groundwater? And the blue states are the ones that say yes, the tan states said no, and then some gave no answer. When I presented this at a meeting in which there were some people from Nebraska, they said, no, you got Nebraska wrong. And I had, you know, some others say, you don't have it right. But then if you look into it, it's all about how you worded the question, right? It could be how you worded the question. It could be who you asked to answer it. If you do it just a single shot, which is what we did. So I'm going to cover this up so that when you post my presentation in PDF, this isn't going to show. It's going to be, because I don't want to get into a discussion of whether this is right or wrong. But the point is this question of, does law recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater? You can see how many answered no or didn't answer. But this idea of a mosaic, you know, that it's not a single brushstroke, it's more of a mosaic. I can put up a map that I use frequently for Arizona and make that point about Arizona. We can make the point about the US, and then we can, as I mentioned earlier, delve into the states and make the point. We are known in Arizona for our Groundwater Management Act of 1980. It is, I think, still one of the best groundwater laws in the nation, but it only covers what are designated active management areas. Those colored areas, not all of the colored areas that go up the central part of the state and then up into this Prescott area. And then we have irrigation non-expansion areas, but all that tan and that, those are areas where there's basically no groundwater management. Just all you have to do is file a notice of intent to drill, and it's the biggest draw, or you can pump right next to another well. And so even in a state like Arizona, which is known for its groundwater management, we have parts of the state where we are not practicing groundwater management. And then I decided to put on this slide, because it gave me the cover that I wanted for that other slide. But this is a slide that shows a map with the boundaries. The goldish colored areas are tribal nations in Arizona. We have many tribal nations. They have a sovereignty when it comes to their water management. And so you have, again, another reason for having differences in mosaics, very complex. We all in the room know this, but not all do. So from that initial survey of the states, we wrote a paper. It was published in the journal Groundwater, one word, Bill, right? And we called it Groundwater Governance in the United States, Common Priorities and Challenges. And throughout my presentation, I put a little snapshots of a few articles I've written in case any of you want to go back to any of them. But this is the definition we used. We worked hard to try to make it a one-sentence definition. There are many, many definitions of water governance and groundwater governance. This is the one we use: the overarching framework of groundwater use laws, regulations, and customs, as well as the processes of engaging the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. This is an academic type, but it's a definition. A lot of people, when you think of governance, you think government, but they're not the same. Government is a smaller segment of the governance framework. And then there often comes up the question, well, what do we mean by governance and what do we mean by management? And for me, I look at management as the what we do. Those things we do within the framework of the regulations, within the governance framework. So for example, in Arizona, we have a very robust legislative framework for underground water storage and recovery. And decisions are made by local utilities or others as to how they decide to use that framework. That's the management, that's the decision. Where do they put the storage, the underground storage reservoirs? Where do they put the pumps? And I have a few different articles that I've put up here, again, just for your reference. I'm not going to talk about those articles, but I've written about how Tucson Water has used storage and recovery instead of traditional treatment and direct delivery of Colorado River delivered through the Central Arizona Project. It was their plan B. Plan A didn't work too well. They didn't implement it very well. They went to plan B, but in the process of doing plan B, a storage and recovery approach, they've actually established a very drought-resilient groundwater delivery system to their customers. And then I have a paper on water banking and what we've done with that to deal with future Colorado River shortage, which is not that far into the future. And then there's a paper from the Journal of Hydrology about a project we did down in the southern part of Arizona near the border that deals with climate and groundwater pumping regimes and so forth, and what that might mean for management. One of the reasons I put these up here was to underscore the importance of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity in doing these work. The authors for some of these things, papers are hydrologists, engineers, and also people like me who do not fall into that category. So just a couple of quick slides. I decided to put these in on some of those results of the initial survey, just to say what are the state's groundwater governance priorities. And this way you could check off whichever one you want. And clearly water quality was listed as a concern in every state. Declining groundwater was responded to as a concern in 32. Water users conflict was responded, yes, that's a concern, in 36 of the respondents. And then we asked, to which of the following user groups do groundwater regulations apply? Because again, there are differences. There could be vast differences in what's required of the agricultural sector, for example, in terms of reporting its water use and the like. And so you can see when it came to irrigation associations, 20 responded yes, 31 said all of these. And then if you look at the tools, this is the one on your left, is what tools does the state use to manage groundwater use and quantity, and what to manage quality. And you see a bit of a difference there in terms of the response. So this map shows in a map form an overlay of two different things. The blue and the gray represent the answer to the question, do you have sufficient regulatory capacity to enforce the groundwater priorities? And this was a question asked of state level people, so we didn't get down to the sub-state people. And so the yes or the gray and the blue or the no, and you see a lot of no answers. Now again, we didn't have time to get into the whys and the wherefores for some of these answers. Again, this was a small, we wanted to do it quickly. I wanted to have something to present at that regional consultation. And then the hatched line shows the states that identifying declining groundwater levels as a priority. So if you looked at the blue, the no's, and it's a little dark, I'm not sure how well you can see it, the hatched, those are the ones that say declining groundwater levels are a priority, but we don't have necessarily the enforceability of what regulations we have. So moving along now, I want to talk a little bit, and I'm watching the time here, about some other work we've done. With a small grant from the USGS 104B program, we undertook a study. This was mostly done by a grad student at the time, and we're working on a journal article on this. We've looked at the issue of within state regional cooperation, and we picked 3 cases to look at for that. And a personal, let's say, issue I sometimes have with case studies or with talking about your own area is that sometimes you do your case study, but it's your case and it's so specific to your case. And so in this one, we at least went to 3 cases. There's no magic number to 3 other than it was a small grant. But if you get to too many cases, then it's hard to track and it's hard to draw any conclusions if they're vastly different. And I actually picked 3 cases that I knew about to start out with. One being the Orange County Water District with its very well-known groundwater management and indirect potable reuse system. There's a Central Florida Water Initiative in the Orlando area. I had the pleasure of being invited to one of their early meetings when they were first voluntarily getting together to deal with what to do with the Orlando, with the aquifer in that region, because they had overlapping regional water management districts. And they have environmental regulations for minimum environmental flows. And it's like, we got to get together and talk about these things. And it's now a real thing. It's not a legally enforceable thing, but so let me just very quickly go, oops. We looked at these 3 state case studies within a state, and they're regional. And what we wanted to focus on was the innovation coming out of regional people dealing with the problems, and we looked at the drivers, and I just mentioned a couple here. Of course, a driver is the legislation, either existing or new. But another key driver, particularly in Central Florida, but it's also, it's the avoidance of litigation or the avoidance of federal intervention. We have a major initiative right now about protecting Lake Mead on the Colorado River. And if you see the movie The Central Arizona Project is produced, we have photos of the US Capitol. And it's like, okay, either you figure out what you're doing among yourselves, the 7 states and the Republic of Mexico, or for the US side, the federal government has the authority to come in and make decisions for you. So those kinds of drivers are important. The case studies and much other work underscores the importance of stakeholder engagement. This happens to be a figure from a paper that a former grad student of mine and I published in the journal Water that talks about the importance of process and how it's iterative and how you sometimes need a bridging organization and the importance of advisory committees when doing these projects and dealing with these tough issues. Some people, I think, have already alluded to the fact that it's not only about the engineering, it's not even only about the money, it's so much about the process of getting to a decision, and a lot of work and resources and time have to go into that. So there's a lot of searching for solutions that's going on. Sometimes in at least my state of Arizona, they say talk, 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 but where's the action? It's hard because these are local decisions. People don't want to pay for somebody else's water. You know, there's an aversion to cross subsidy and sharing of that. And so this is wherever you go almost in the world, you know, even in places that you sometimes think are water abundant, like you kind of think Florida gets a lot of rain, it's water abundant. Well, they have these issues. These are the kinds of things that come up in the solution set. And I did put financing there at the bottom because that's a really important consideration. As more and more governments are constrained or restrained by legislation, sometimes the importance or possibilities with public-private partnerships step up. We heard that in the movie about the private sector funding things. And there's an aversion to that with water. We get into some of those value judgments about water is a human right and not the private sector, but that's another topic for maybe some side discussion. So I did want to just mention that I talked about the importance of the law. There's tremendous divergence, disparity in the extent to which laws recognize the natural systems, the environment as a water demanding, water needing sector. And you'll see a lot of divergence in approaches across the states and region. And it's also sometimes very hard to quantify, very hard to value. Nick, you may have done some work in trying to value this. And sometimes people, they don't believe economists generally, I think, but they definitely have trouble when it comes to sometimes valuing these environmental natural systems because you don't go and pay for them and so forth. And something that's very important is we work to solutions. I mentioned the Colorado River Basin. If some of you have questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about that. I'd be happy to talk about the binational studies. There, what we did was, you know, very often you have maps, most often at the US side and at the border. You have maps for the Mexico that end at the border. You have different kinds of data, qualities of data, and a tremendous amount of effort went into compiling what do we know about these aquifers and how can we harmonize the data we do have. And there's it's being released in both English and Spanish, and it's really a first ever of its kind of study. And we released in English a prior draft final back in January, but the official will be coming out very, very soon. Now, I want to get to this issue. I did ask Cassie, and thank you for printing out my most recent column. One of the things I do is I write a quarterly column, and this is the most recent one about the invisible water. There's a lot of effort, and Bill's going to mention this, I think, in his talk, to raise the visibility of groundwater and its good management with the public, with professionals, with water managers, because we can't see it. And your graphics in your movie were great, and you got that question about how the effort you put in to make the groundwater visible. It is difficult to see. And I put this photo up there. There's a photographer from Canada, Edward Bertinsky. If you ever see the traveling exhibit of his photographs, they were taken around the world over a period of 6 years. It's a marvelous exhibit. And this is one of his of the Colorado Delta, where you can just see how that delta water at least once reached through and the veins and so forth. And, you know, we just can't see that very well. Although, you know, we do have satellite imagery, and I'm not here to argue the pluses or minuses of the interpretations of GRACE imagery and all that. That's beyond my scope of knowledge. But this is a figure that was shown in a paper that was released not that long ago. And you see groundwater storage trends, 2003 to 12. And take a look at where it's red, and take a look that it's not red in Arizona. Yet if you look at some other maps that people show and you look at what's happened with overdraft, you'll see red, you know, like the bad colors for Arizona. Well, this is reflecting what we've been doing with water banking, you know, and what we've been doing with storage and recovery. And so some of these times you can see the results of what you've been doing with some groundwater in some of this imagery that We just have to make sure we interpret it correctly. So I wanted to mention, I put up the slide. I did have my water cycle slide. I made the slide up for something else I recently did, but I got into alliteration, obviously. And, but these are some of the C's. These are the things we're working through. And this issue of community, collaboration, compromise, those are all things that everybody is dealing with and we have to be mindful of. And I noticed that last night in the movie, at least twice, I wrote it down both times I thought, the word mirage was used. And we do have a movie that we have made in my college. It's been a collaborative effort of my water center and the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and Arizona Public Media called Beyond the Mirage. And Cody Sheehy is the filmmaker. It was premiered in Arizona in April. It's a 1-hour documentary, and it is now being shown, it might be almost over, in about 80 different public media markets in the US. And so it's not available for live stream yet. It will be once it gets through that process, and it is available in DVD. And so if you ever need a movie sometime for a program, let me know, and we could send you one. It covers the Colorado River Basin, but it also goes to Israel. The filmmaker came with me to Israel and filmed some of the solutions they've developed there in the Middle East. And the purpose of the project was to raise awareness about water. We have, people get their water every day, reliably, cleanly, and yet we have some real water challenges. So we got a prize and put in some money to help raise awareness. And it has broader implications than just Arizona. But what's really neat about it, and I wasn't trying to do too much hawking here of stuff, so I didn't put the slide in, but the website is beyondthemirage.org, just all one word, beyondthemirage.org. Besides having the documentary, we have about 250 one-minute clips or so that you can assemble into your own documentary. And you'll see some angry people in an area of Arizona that are angry about what's going on with their groundwater in that. So with that, I'm out of time, and if we have a minute or two for a couple questions, I'm happy to take them, and I'll be here throughout the program, so I'm happy to talk with you anytime. Thank you.